The first time I heard Dr. Jason Hill speak, I was so moved that I immediately reached out to him to present a lecture for us almost 3 years ago now. Our original date was postponed due to COVID, of course, so I'm especially delighted to finally have him here today. Jason D. Hill is a professor of philosophy at DePaul University and the author of 5 books, one of which he will be signing today immediately after today's lecture. This latest book is called What Do White Americans Owe Black People? I'd like to quote a review of this new book, and I quote, "One of the boldest living thinkers, Jason D. Hill, takes a sledgehammer to everything we've been taught about race and race relations. Written with grace and clarity, this book offers a compelling, unifying vision that moves us beyond the current racial hysteria. It should be mandatory reading for every single American," close quote. Dr. Hill is a specialist in ethics and American politics and has been published in major magazines, including The Federalist, The American Thinker, Commentary, Spike, The Hill, and Salon. He is a Shulman Journalism Fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center, where he writes a weekly column on a wide range of issues that include American, foreign, and domestic policy, issues of culture and race, higher education, and the Middle East. Dr. Hill's scholarly articles have been published in anthologies and journals in Germany, the Czech Republic, and the Netherlands. He has been interviewed regularly in various media outlets, including NBC's Today Show, NPR, The Daily Caller, Fox News, Fox Business, and many other mainstream media. He is writing a new book revealing our universities as sites of terror and national security threats. He's lectured and taught extensively on this subject in the US, Europe, and Asia. Dr. Hill is a devout advocate of Israel, which he regards as an ethical state. He is a staunch supporter of Jewish civilization, which he defends in his scholarship as, quote, an international treasure trove. To quote him directly, and I'm quoting now, "The most beleaguered people on the planet, the Jews, who have faced persecution since their birth as a people, are a living refutation of your claim. When they labored in slavery in Egypt, clamored in Palestine, made magnificent contributions to human civilization in European capitals, sojourned in Africa and Asia, and founded the modern state of Israel, no one gave these heroic people an affirmative action plan to work anywhere. In spite of vitriol and insidious comparisons to vermin and pigs, and despite being subjected to countless pogroms and mandated ghettos, they thrived and flourished because not for one moment did they ever believe that their struggle for liberation lay in any hands other than their own," close quote. He is deeply committed to moral foundationalism, moral universalism, and the absolutism of reason. Dr. Hill came to this country at the age of 20 from Jamaica and thrived beyond his wildest dreams. He remains incredibly grateful to America for its bountiful opportunities, and it is my greatest privilege and honor to welcome Dr. Jason D. Hill.
I'm very grateful and I'm very, very delighted to be speaking to all of you. I must say that I was speaking to Lauren before, and this is the second Jewish organization that I have had the privilege of speaking to, besides the ZOA, which gave me an award a couple years ago and invited me to Israel, for the sole reason that I have been canceled by about 12 organizations on the premise that what I had to say was either too controversial or too inflammatory towards the arch enemies of both Israel, every Jew in this room, every Jew in the world, that is Hamas, the Palestinian Authority, and that I was supposed to say very nice things about Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, two egregious terrorist organizations whose charters are explicitly and egregiously devoted to the elimination of Jewry and all Jews from the face of the earth. And of course, I steadfastly declined having the kind of integrity that I do have. So it is with great pleasure and with great gratitude that I accept this invitation here with no conditions by Lauren to not say anything unpleasant about Hamas or the Palestinian Authority, because I have full intention of saying a couple of not nasty but truthful things about those horrific organizations. I will start my talk with an epigraph, a motto that I usually start my talks with. And it is Nemo me impune licessit. No one attacks me with impunity, which is the Latin motto of the Royal Stuart dynasty of Scotland from at least the reign of James the Sixth. So we live in an era, ladies and gentlemen, when it is almost rhetorical to talk about Jewish contributions to the world and to Western civilization. When Jewish civilizations, and I say civilizations because there are various iterations of Jewish civilizations, I must say. When we look at the inception of the Jewish people over 3,000 years ago, when we look at Jewish civilization and we look at Jewish contributions to Western civilization and to world civilization, there is an inexorability and an inextricability in which the Jewish people and their civilization are tied to Western civilization. I must say that my appreciation is a dispassionate one, although my maternal grandmother was born and raised by means of a Jewish grandfather. My great-grandfather was a Sephardic Jew who came to Jamaica by way of Portugal and Spain. And so my grandmother, who was raised by this Jewish grandfather, by this Jewish father, had many Jewish sensibilities to her, but it was extraordinarily difficult for Jews under British colonial rule to practice their religion. The English, I must say, were a tough lot. They made it not only difficult for people of color, but for Jews in the Western Hemisphere. But my appreciation for Jewish civilization is purely dispassionate and scholarly, although it has grown personal and intimate and almost visceral over the years, on the premise that not all cultures and not all civilizations are equal. Yet we live in an era of abject cultural relativism when indeed all cultures are regarded as equal, and it is lost upon the world that as an unprecedented phenomenon, Jewish civilization is what I would call an international treasure trove. That is, all talk about the contributions that Jews have made to the world is evident to all of us. When we talk about the creation of historical time, when we talk about the creation of a sacred covenant which today suffuses all our relationships with people, when we talk about the emancipation from a cyclicality of life, the emancipation of ourselves as being biological creatures into moral creatures, when we talk about the progress, the notion of moral progress, when we talk about the development of moral consciousness and accountability to a monotheistic God, when we talk about the creation of law, of universal law that governs all people as one people, we are the legatees, of course, of Judaic identity. So I'm not here really to give a litany of the enormous contributions that Jewish civilizations have made to the world. What I want to talk about are at least 3 existential threats that I see posing a threat to Jewish civilization, and to offer at least some sort of remedy to these maladies, these threats, these existential threats that are posed to Jewish civilization. So what are these threats, and how can we sort of deal with them? Well, let me start off by being very controversial, to which I'm no stranger, that the biggest threat, the first threat, is not anti-Semitism. It is anti-Semitism, but it is not anti-Semitism that comes from Islam, nor is it anti-Semitism that comes from the ghastly anti-Semitic world of Europe, of the UN, which I'll talk about later on. It is the anti-Semitism that comes from the Jewish left. And here,
we have some of us have difficulty understanding you. Could you speak a little louder or have a microphone?
well, it's very difficult because I don't. How is this? What if I held the microphone to my mouth? Would that be better? Is this better? All right. Because it's very difficult to position the microphone and actually read from a text. So can you hear me more clearly? All right. Okay, now we're rock and rolling. All right. So it is very difficult for me to understand this kind of threat from the Jewish left, where the Jewish left seems to be complicit, either by default or by intention, with enemies of Israel and those who would wish to eradicate Jewry from the face of the earth, right? This threat is an internal threat, and it is the greatest threat among all the existential threats that I can think of. Why? Because it leaves a civilization defenseless and without what I would call moral inoculants to defend itself from the subsequent and concomitant external threats. These are individuals who go along with the idea that Israel is a genocidal and apartheid state, when nothing could be further from the truth. Israel is a beacon of light in a dark, primordial backwater of politically regressive states. And when I say politically regressive states, I'm talking about Saudi Arabia, I'm talking about Gaza, I'm talking about Iran, I'm talking about Qatar, which is the 3rd largest sponsor of terrorism. I don't know why Qatar happens to be an ally of the United States of America when it goes around sponsoring terrorism along with Saudi Arabia and Iran. I'm talking about Bahrain. I'm talking about every godforsaken nation, if you can call them nations, or states in that region besides Israel. Israel is the only beacon of light and the only civilization, or the only nation that qualifies as a civilization or even a culture on that dark, barbaric continent. And that we can have people on the left sanctioning the idea that Israel, that is also the only state in that region which is a home to refugees seeking refuge from persecution based on their sexual orientation, that is the LGBTQ++ community that goes to Israel from Iran, believe it or not, from other Gulf states, and seek refuge in Israel. It is the only beacon of light in that dark continent, and that the left could pay, the Jewish left could pay unconscionable lip service to those who cast Israel as an apartheid genocidal state, those who don't know the difference between the ethicality of Israel, the ethical state that Israel is, and what an apartheid state looks like, and what a genocidal state looks like, dare I say, they ought to know the difference the hard way. I'm not here to state the motives of such people. Only they and their psychologists, and only they and their conscience are qualified to know their motives. And to support and sanction one's destroyers, however, is so morally vicious a crime that one would have to struggle to find a charitable explanation. But one student of mine, whose name shall remain a secret, who classifies herself as a Reconstructionist Jew, laid the situation out to me very, very clearly. She sat me down and she said, Jason, let me tell you, as a Reconstructionist Jew on the left, exactly what my plan for Jews and for Israel are. And I said, have a go at it. And she said, here we go. I go to Israel every summer, and I go to the West Bank, and I stopped her. I said, please don't refer to it as the West Bank. It's Judea and Samaria. She said, my goal is to have that country renamed Palestine. She said, I go to stage demonstrations with my Palestinian brothers and sisters against Israel, against the settlers who are there, and to fund legal clinics to evacuate the settlers from the West Bank. And it's time, she says, that Jews got a taste of their own medicine. I paused for a while, and I pointed out to her that to begin with, the Israeli Jews are not settlers in Judea and Samaria, and that from here on they should be referred to as heroic pioneers, although you really cannot be a pioneer on your own indigenous land. It's ridiculous, really. But for the sake of simplicity, let's call them heroic pioneers on refounded land in Holy Israel. I told her that this is the land of Moses, a nation unified under King David, the only nation blessed by God in the Bible, renamed Palestine by the Romans in the 2nd century, and later artificially divided into 3 states. I told her to remember that this is a nation occupied and destroyed, and its people exiled and conquered immorally under the Egyptians in 1523 BCE, 1313 BCE, by Babylon under King Nebuchadnezzar in 423 BCE to 372 BCE, by Persia Media in 372 BCE to 140 BCE, Greece in 371 BCE to 140 BCE, and Rome 69 under the Common Era to the present. And that under the Roman Empire, we witnessed the apocalyptic and most devastating blow to Jewish sovereignty that lasted for 2,000 years. That it allowed for, among other dastardly intrusions, occupation under the Ottoman and British empires. And I told her, let us not forget a few historical minutiae, that with the legal refounding, and I use the word refounding, of the State of Israel in 1948, the local Palestinian militia group, along with Egypt, Jordan, then Transjordan, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, fought a vicious war along with contingent forces from Saudi Arabia and Yemen to annihilate tiny Israel, and that Jordan confiscated Judea and Samaria, which it illegally annexed in 1950. In a 1967 six-day defensive war against Jordan, Israel retook its holy lands of Judea and Samaria from Jordan. And that we should remember that Judea and Samaria historically belonged to Holy Israel and the Jewish people. It never belonged to, quote, and I put in quotes, a Palestinian state, nor to a political entity known as, quote, the Palestinians. And that we should remember that the Palestinians are really Jordanians. There are no such people as the Palestinian people. Before 1964, the reference of such a term were the Jewish people. In any case, the post-1964 self-described Palestinians only began claiming Judea and Samaria, or what they call the West Bank, following the Israeli defensive war against Jordan in 1967. The PLO was formed in 1964 to establish a Palestinian state inside the State of Israel, and there was no mention of the West Bank, which had been illegally annexed by Jordan, as part of a Palestinian state before 1967. So the world must now say to the people who refer to themselves as Palestinians, I said to this student, your people waged a ruthless war against Israel. You lost the war. And rather than be grateful that Israel did not fight a war of attrition as the United States did in Dresden, Germany, and Nagasaki and Hiroshima in Japan, and annihilated you completely, as it probably should have, you have the temerity to proclaim you have a right to reclaim rightfully won land. So we must therefore strike from our vocabulary the term occupied territory. The Transjordan annexation of Judea and Samaria was regarded as illegal. The British had relinquished its claim to the land when the British mandate left the region, and the Arab forces claimed vehemently that the 1949 armistice line did not have any legal significance. Now, ladies and gentlemen, by that reasoning, the land did not belong to anyone. And since the land did not belong to Transjordan, we must stop using the term occupied territory and honor the precepts of international law. It is nonsensical nomenclature, period. If disputed land makes better sense, then that conceptually inane turn was laid to rest when Israel won a war and conquered territory that was taken from it. And we must remember, too, that both Hamas and first the PLO and the Palestinian National Authority have made a permanent declaration of war against Israel. A permanent declaration of war. Why do I say this? Because their charters both call for the obliteration of the State of Israel and the removal of Jewry from the area, along with the indoctrination school curriculum promulgating hatred and debasement against Jews and Israel. Both the PA and Hamas, the charters indict both parties in a state of war against Israel. Now, as far as I'm concerned, the Second Intifada, orchestrated by the PLO leader, then PLO leader, the terrorist Yasser Arafat, completely neutralized the Oslo Accords. This means that any action, and I mean any action that Israel takes against the PA and those who voted into power, such as refusal to confer citizenship and voting privilege to a population that vote terrorist organizations into power, are moral responses to a declaration of permanent war by sworn enemies of the state. There can be no peace once those charters exist. We must remember that before the 1948 refounding of Israel, that region called Judea and Samaria, in fact, the land today, referred today as the State of Israel, under the British mandate, was a primitive and primordial backwater with a few buildings, a few planted trees, and grazing sheep with a plethora of shepherds. But it lay outside the historical process, and it was not progressing towards any growth and technological prosperity. Its trajectory was an inverted one. The pastoral and bucolic lives of shepherds make for very nice short stories and sentimental poetry. An emulative and monumental civilization they do not constitute. If there are occupiers in Judea and Samaria, then we may ostensibly point to them as the war settlers who are the Jordanian Palestinians. They are the real occupiers and improper settlers of the land. And so we must say to the Israelis, you have to expunge from your identities the term settlers and see yourselves as noble pioneers fulfilling your lost manifest destiny. In the name of the best within you, do not sully and do not tarnish it by the prejudicial ways an envious and anti-Jewry world regards you and wants you to view yourself. Do not bind to their terminology, because the only way the moral legitimacy of the refounding of your holy lands can be intransigently enforced and asserted to the world is if, on moral grounds, you persuade your grounds to totally annex all of Judea and Samaria, if such is the will of the Israeli people. Desist in referring to it as the West Bank, and most importantly, declare proudly to the world that as noble post-pioneers, your moral identities are non-negotiable. Announce defiantly that you have the moral right to determine who lives within the borders of your annexed territories, and treat your moral identity with the same implacability as you would a religious commandment. Let it be known that such an identity is a force of nature that behaves with the same inexorability and invariability as do the laws of nature. Proclaim proudly that you are noble pioneers and refounders of lost treasure troves of holy Israel. And if you can do this consistently and without compromise to your sworn enemies, then the glory is yours. Now, in keeping with the first existential threat, I would say that the anti-Zionist movement, which is part of the Jewish left, has got to be reckoned with. That is, the move to expunge Zionism from Jewish identity is both, to me, cowardly and phony. Now, I speak as a non-Jewish Zionist proudly. I'm not here to make the moral case for Zionism. I don't have the time to do so, and I don't think among this group I need to do that. It exists, it is real, and it is morally unassailable. It needs to be proclaimed loudly as a moral badge of honor. But to hold it means to see, among other things, resist seeing the Palestinians as the moral responsibility of Israel. They are not. They are war refugees. And they are the responsibility of the host territory that began an offensive war back in 1967. I think as political ballast, such people can neither be wards of the state of Israel, nor be permitted to become, in all cases, wholesale citizens. I think Israel made an altruistic mistake in regarding the Palestinian people after the 1967 defensive war with Jordan as their ethical responsibility. I think rather than regard them as war settlers or refugees, or as legally occupying conquered territory or illegal occupants, they made the Palestinian people their political and moral problem. I think after victory, the war settlers could have been seen as enemies of the state, supporters of the Fatah, Palestinian Liberation Organization, the charter which again basically calls for the end of Jewry. I think under a malevolent and illiberal regime, they would have been treated and regarded as such. But because Israel is an ethical state, it did not treat them as such. It treats them as persons with specific inalienable rights to Israel. There can be no such thing as a Palestinian territory in a geographic region legally seized in a defensive war instigated by a foreign aggressor. Now, the purpose of war, I think, is not just to vanquish one's enemy. When I teach the just war theory, I think part of what I teach is also it is to inflict generational damage so that future generations cannot harm you. And that the losers of war cannot make demands on the victors that the victors themselves would not have been put in the position of meeting had the adversary enemy not enforced or forced the victors into making in the first place. To the Jewish far left, I would say that Israel was forced into a war which it won, and it was then expected to renounce and repudiate the consequences of its fairly won war by capitulating to the conditions of its vanquished enemy, which included, among other things, self-sacrificially undertaken goals, granting statehood, autonomy, right of return, and the elimination of Jewry from the region. I would say that the Israeli left should abandon its agonistic hand-wringing over the so-called Palestinian occupation and realize that Israeli law in Judea and Samaria, meaning the wholesale destruction of, among other things, Gaza, Hamas in Gaza, it being a terrorist organization that can claim no right as a group and no right to any square inch of land in that region, is an application of democratic law protecting the rights of individuals who rightfully belong there. Now, in the interest of time, there's so much more I want to say about that, but I want to move into the second existential threat. And well, a bit more on the issue of Zionism. I think so long as Israel is threatened with annihilation by Arab countries pretending to be friends, so long as Iran's deadly ambition include the annihilation of Israel, and so long as Hamas's charter and the PA's charter calls for the murder of Jews, and so long as many European countries and that ghastly phenomenon known as United Nations, which should be abolished immediately, continues to seat horrific anti-Semitic moral henchmen on the planet. I just want to say that I think Zionism remains the only viable moral defense of Jewish civilization writ large. It's not just an identity, but it's a moral, prescriptive principle, and indeed an ethical code that legitimizes Jews as fiduciaries and rightful custodians of Israel. It is a justificatory schema that secures the rightful place of Jews on Israeli soil. And it secures the role of Israel in establishing a thriving modern Jewish civilization, embodiment of Jewish people and their connection to the homeland, their homeland. Okay, on to the second existential threat. Now, I think the near universal hatred of Jews and of Israel is a resentment of Jews because they were the first creators, but they were first discoverers of moral law. Jews are the binding conscience of human moral life, and we are the legatees. When I say we, I mean Gentiles and everyone else, the handmaiden of an antecedent monotheistic religious system. And I think Jews will always, let me just say, I think Jews will always be resented for beating everyone to the race, right? It wasn't a race, actually. There is a sort of a feral, primordial impulse to circumvent morality in order to engage in what one believes is radical freedom. That is a kind of nihilistic freedom, when in truth, freedom is to be found within the confines of moral law. I speak as a writer who finds my greatest freedom is found in adhering to the laws of grammar, right? We find freedom within rules. We don't find freedom in violating and flouting rules. Freedom comes from adhering to certain rules. And so our greatest freedom as individuals is to be found in obeying moral laws, or else we become feral animal creatures. So the moral restraint on what one believes is radical freedom. On the anarchical impulses in human beings was put to rest by the deputized Jew, who is a stand-in, a bearer of universal law. And I think the non-Jew can ostensibly point not to Christ, but to Moses and the prophets as progenitors who tie them down in moments when they'd rather be free nihilistically. So what we find in the external world in terms of anti-Semitism is envy, resentment, and jealousy that lie at the heart of ineradicable anti-Semitism and anti-Jewry. So I think the non-Jew and even Jew haters hate the phenomenon that transformed human beings from a cyclical biological creature into a moral agent. And the accountability, the moral responsibility in averting our snouts from the ground and lifting them to the heavens, where we could pin our aspirational identities to a monotheistic God, was forged in the crucibles of Judaism, where we are enshrined in a new set of moral vocabularies that transformed our souls and give us a new aspirational identity: justice, accountability, redemption, remorse, guilt. These are all foundations, these are all norms forged in the crucibles of Judaic identity, which have given us our contemporary the foundations of our moral agency. And people will always hate the Jew because he or she is a symbolic representation against animality, against chaos, against anarchy, against the impulse to control that which compromises the pleasure principle and the indiscriminate desire for hedonic pleasure. So the moral concomitant of all of this is what I would call Jewish law. And so people will hate the Jew because he's the bearer of law and of laws that forced human beings to matriculate from psychological infancy into the full-fledged adult moral agents that many of us are today. And the desire for growth competes as equally with the desire for inversion and regression. So the Judaic identity emerges as a moral identity, an aspirational one, a command to rise. And moral laziness in individuals is offset, I think, by the ethicality of Judaic identity, which is a mandate to repair the world, the capacity to provide for others and to take care of others, and through the aspirational desire to leave a legacy. So how might Jews fight against an assault against Jewish civilization? Well, I don't think it's by education alone, because I think quite often we see this with sexism and racism. The more sometimes you educate people about another set of people, is the more they resent them, because the discriminated class now becomes an intimidating presence, right? We see when men are educated about the virtues and the capabilities of women, some men despise women more because they become their competitors and they resent the fact that they cannot make women into these inferior creatures. They have to revise their narratives. So I think one of the ways that Jewish civilization and Jews can sort of combat, in my mind, this kind of what I called quasi-ineradicable, that's an oxymoron, anti-Semitism, is simply by asserting the civilization values via a cultural process. That is by inundating the world, colonizing it with Jewish values, not by proselytizing, because Jews by nature, thank God, are not a proselytizing people, but through certain virtues, and I'm thinking here of Tikkun Olam, repairing the world, being God's partner, Halakha, walking the path, a community of doers in the ethical realm through the commandments that obligate us towards our fellow human beings, in the ritual realm, that is acts that tie Jews to God, and also applying spiritual beliefs to conduct, even in the most mundane and human affairs, what we could call the quotidian, the ordinary ways of living, so that we spiritualize and make holy and reverential every aspect of living. And then there is, of course, teshuvah, the returning, the faith in human change, the belief as God does that people can change as is evident in the story of Jonah, which is, among other things, restoring one's lost inner balance. So the praxis that is at the heart of Jewish identity is a source from which to heal from the bad things that are going to happen. When my students ask me, why should I do good things in the world when bad things are going to happen to good people? I say, terminate the fantasy. Bad things will always happen to good people because suffering is intractably, irrevocably built into the nature of life. But your goodness is the only source from which you will heal from the bad things that will inevitably happen to you. That is a very Jewish way of looking at the world. So no one has ever healed from character rot. No one has ever healed from a source of evil. And the final threat, I think, existential threat, I think, is found in an absence, paradoxically, the creation of which is going to function as an inoculant against any existential threat. And that, I think, is what I would call the absence of a manifest destiny for Israel. Now, every nation has a manifest destiny. America had one. I think it died when Mr. Reagan and the Cold War ended, and America lost its purpose. And the West has lost its purpose in the world. It doesn't know what to do with itself anymore. After the Berlin Wall fell and communism fell and the bipolar world came to an end, the West and America lost its mission statement, and we don't know what to do with ourselves anymore. Iran has a manifest destiny. Its manifest destiny, make no bones about it, is to stockpile its uranium stockpile, to destroy Israel. Hamas has a manifest destiny. It's stated in its charter to establish a global caliphate and to rid the world of Jewry and Jews. Saudi Arabia has a manifest destiny to spread its Wahhabi faith, not so surreptitiously and circuitously throughout the world. China has a manifest destiny to annex at least a third of the globe. It owns most of Africa by now, and it's making vast inroads into the region where I hail from, which is the Caribbean. Russia has a manifest destiny. Its manifest destiny is to go around the world undermining democracies. So every country has to have a manifest destiny, has to have a telos of where its political, moral, spiritual, political philosophy will culminate in something tangible that will aid and advance its well-being, its flourishing. And it seems to me Israel has had an offensive, or defensive, I should say, manifest destiny, where it's constantly trying to convince the world that it's not an apartheid genocidal state, trying to get the world to love it, trying to get the world to convince that it's a good place when its ethicality is already built into the nature of Judaism, trying to get the world to see that any offensive attack that it takes against the PA or against Hamas is justified. And part, I think, of Israel's manifest destiny has got to be to wean itself from U.S. dependency, to be fully autonomous and sovereign, and refrain from needing the nod and approval from America and depending on America's military and political decisions. May we long to see the day in which Iran, which poses again an existential threat to Israel, along with Hamas, both face a ruthless, annihilator response from Israel. An Israel that can take responsibility unilaterally without worrying that the U.S. will be a little bit upset when she acts with unilateral, acts unilaterally. So what? A nation prostrating itself like some obsequious babbit before the world will never earn it respect. I say better for Israel to be feared and respected than strive for a love. It by its nature will never, perhaps never earn it. It is too damn good for the rest of the world, a world of pretentious, sanctimonious, self-righteous mediocrities. No, I'm saying that we all need allies. We need France, we need Germany, but we don't look to Mr. Macron if we want to bomb a country. We don't look to the former Chancellor of Germany, Mrs. Merkel, if we wanted to take an action against one of our enemies. We against when President Bush bombed the hell out of Afghanistan and Iran, we acted unilaterally in cases. I'm saying, of course, Israel needs an ally in America, but I don't think that acting obsequiously and waiting for the permission of America is in the best interest of Israel. I long for the day when Israel can stand proudly as an equal with the United States of America. All right, so we'll get to this but let me finish. So part of the new Manifest Destiny will involve the principle of what I call lex, or what is known as lex talionis, the law of retaliation, one of the great advances in the history. And its ruling principle is justice. So in wrapping up, let me say that when we talk about dealing with cultivating a manifest destiny, and when we talk about dealing with Hamas, I'm going to end my talk by saying something quite controversial here. All right, my notes are a little bit mixed up here. I know, I'm trying to find my notes. I'm sorry. All right, so in closing, in speaking about Israel's manifest destiny and in speaking about the retaliatory responses that I think Israel should take, I think Israel is simply buying time. Hamas is a malignant cancer, and Gaza is a host in which that cancer grows. It exists because the people there, by democratic vote, granted it the power to rule. No distinction can legitimately be made between the citizens and the terrorist overlords who rule that strip of desolation, putrefaction, and destruction. That the citizens have allowed themselves to be used as cannon fodder is not Israel's problem. When our drone president, Barack Obama, was indiscriminately dropping missiles on Afghanistan in a war of terror that killed countless civilians, much of the world remained silent, and his Nobel Prize was not rescinded. What is the ultimate solution for Israel when and if it stops capitulating to the world condemnation, public opinion, and when it refrains from playing altruistic skirmishes with Gaza? Well, here is something to ponder, ladies and gentlemen. When the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor on January 7th, 1941, killing more than 2,300 Americans, the United States knew that the response would have to be decisive and lethal. The purpose of war is to vanquish one's enemies, to obliterate it completely, and further, as I said, inflict generational damage. The response was the moral atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and a series of Farah bombings and air raids of Tokyo. The ultimate defeat of Hitler included the bombing of Dresden. Now, there was a time in history when real men, and I say real men, because we're living in a time where men are completely emasculated, when real men who oversaw wars knew how to fight them and knew how to win them. There was a decisiveness, a deliberateness, and a dignity in how these men fought such wars. The bombings of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Tokyo, and Dresden were proper. They were moral and they were inevitable. They defended the right, an unassailable right to self-defense, and they secured a lasting peace. They sent an ominous message on the order of, if you try to kill us, we will destroy you. When Israel decides who and what it wants to be as the only moral state and the only noble state in that section of the world, it will realize that no lasting civilization has ever succeeded or survived without a manifest destiny. Perhaps it will gaze out at the decrepit wasteland of Gaza that exists solely to destroy it, and it will remember the flourishing agricultural mecca it once was under Israeli stewardship. There will be no moral paralysis. There will be no lugubrious memories, just a burning pride, and perhaps some enduring moral inspiration of how her moral alter ego, the United States of America, defeated her enemies when they dared question her supremacy. And in those moments, when attacked, something sacred happened. The fourth angel did indeed pour out his vial upon the sun, and power was given unto him to scorch men with fire. Thank you.